Does that need to be our cold open?
I'd like some ribs with a side of corruption.
Yes.
And some French fries. Something to soothe my soul. Hello and welcome to Let's Pod This. My name is Andy Moore. Good to see you. To my co-hosts, I can't see you. Listeners, you could email us pictures. No, don't do that. That gets risky in a hurry. Anyway, Bailey Perkins Wright, good to see you.
Good to see you, Andy. Hello.
Scott Melson, good to see you.
What is up, man?
You know, the just another Friday night in the big town here in Oklahoma. Listeners, we are nearing the end of the state legislative session, possibly as little as a week away if the rumors are true. And they, they're not never true. Sometimes they're true. But I expect in the next couple of weeks, the legislature will sine die. We'll talk about where they're at now in that process, or at least where we think, because it's a bit of a black hole up there. We will definitely talk about some barbecue and some shenanigans, because that, yet again, is in the news. We'll talk about some weed unrelated to, snacks or anything. And then just general updates on Oklahoma.
Like transitions.
Yeah, transitions. That's right. State agency transitions and just where things are at, with Oklahoma politics and government and civic engagement in our state. So let's start with where things are at, quite literally, with sine die nearing us. That means that the big discussion is the budget, of course. However, I have not heard very much in terms of like hard and fast data. No proposals have been released publicly, which is not uncommon, but usually there's some indication, but it's been pretty tightly locked down up there. Bailey, you are probably at the Capitol more than Scott and I. Have you heard anything?
Well, I will say for the listeners, I've been out for the past couple of weeks for work. For building my home and for wrapping up my Leadership Oklahoma experience. And so, but a couple of things that I have heard as of late has been just the differences in what members of the House and members of the Senate want to see, right? In one branch, there is in our chamber, I guess I should say, not branch. In one chamber, there's an appetite for tax cuts. And in another chamber, there is no appetite, right? And I would say even more nuclear than chambers, certain members want to see broad tax cuts, while others want to, monitor this time because they know that, it's not going to be money flowing forever in the ways that it is now. What we're experiencing as a state is an anomaly. And so I heard that even Chairman Thompson wasn't interested in exploring massive tax cuts this legislative session. So I guess the reason it's been so tight-lipped, as my guess, is that there's still a number of negotiations happening to figure out what the appetite is of members and where they can find a compromise. Like, for instance, on the grocery sales tax. So there's been conversation over the past year about eliminating the state portion of the sales tax on groceries. But there's a few proposals that are still alive out there. For example, one proposal would temporarily exempt the state portion of the sales tax for the next couple of years, because we know that we do have, a few dollars thanks to the federal investments that have been made in this time. But then there's a proposal that would permanently remove it, which would mean that $300+ million, would be permanently taken out of our state budget. And then there's another proposal related to the sales tax relief credit that is currently in place, but it's a really, really low amount because it hasn't been updated in like 20, 30 years. And so there's a proposal to boost that credit up to maybe something like $120 that then serves almost like as a rebate to Oklahomans to get that money back during their tax season. And so there's a number of different proposals out there, and it's all going to tie to, what is the appetite. There's still rumors of the legislature giving Oklahomans, about $125 check as an income tax rebate, or they could reduce a bracket of the income tax again, which would mean permanently, right, reducing that revenue source. And so I don't think there's an exact understanding yet of what proposal is going to be moving forth. But what I have heard is that the more temporary relief options are the ones that have the greatest appetite, especially because there's a number of members who were there at the Capitol about 5-6 years ago when we had to figure out how to, patch holes in the budget to not make the ship sink, right? So it'll be interesting to see, Andy, because and this is not unusual, right, for the legislature. This is on par with the way it's always been, to where there are 6 or 7 people talking, sitting in a room, and then one day, boom, a bill drops and it's the budget, right? And that's what I suspect this go around is, within the next week or so, there's going to be a day or maybe a big press conference or something, and boom, the budget's going to drop. So I guess we'll all see.
It is interesting because, Bailey, as you pointed out, like these negotiations, this is how it always plays out, right? Like the budget negotiations happen between leadership, they happen behind closed doors, and that's for a bunch of reasons. Some of them are good reasons, some of them are bad reasons, but sometimes those negotiations spill out, right? Like sometimes those negotiations, there's leakage, right? Sometimes there's stories and rumors and
dueling press conferences. We've had that a couple of years.
Over the budget negotiations. That has not happened this year. One thing I have heard that I feel pretty confident about, obviously, as you guys know, I'm not in the budget negotiations. They don't invite me, but one thing I have heard that I feel pretty confident is there's been a lot of wondering about whether or not Senator Treat's voucher bill was going to come back as part of the budget negotiations. I've heard that's off the table. I've heard that is not happening this year. That will probably make an appearance next year, I think, but that's the voucher bill looks like it is dead for the time being and is not going to be part of the budget. What I've heard, but maybe that's
yeah. I mean, who knows? That's really interesting though, Scott, because what I've heard, and I think Bailey's heard the same thing because we've been on some of the same calls recently, is that one of Treat's other bills, Senate Joint Resolution, SJR 43, which I think we mentioned in passing early on in session. And I think a lot of us thought, or at least hoped, that it was dead. It is not.
It's a reminder that nothing is dead until it's dead.
That's
Those
exactly
zombies
right.
still float around.
And so I would assume that it is part of these negotiations. Now, we'll talk about this because it is not actually a revenue-related measure. And so it's somewhat unusual that it's still around. And so this measure, SJR 43, would essentially remake the entire judicial branch of our government, right? From like the top down, not the state Supreme Court. So not all the way to the top, but it would do away. Well, I guess even the state Supreme Court, honestly, it would do away with the Judicial Nominating Committee. It would it would replace all of the judges that are on retention ballots or elected ballots now. It would take most of them at the end of their term. They would not be able to run for re-election. They would have to be appointed by whomever's the governor at that time that their term is up. So it would institute a ton of governor appointed judges, and then for what they call the inferior judges, like lower down district courts, some of that stuff, those would be elected, but they would be partisan elections. It just says they'd be elected in the same manner as the county officials. So it'd be partisan elections. So it would effectively partisanize judges that aren't already partisan races. It would allow the governor to appoint a ton of them, and it would do away with the oversight, right? The check that we have in the Judicial Nominating Committee, which nominates 3 judges for the state Supreme Court, or the Court of Civil Appeals, and then the governor picks from one of those three. And in doing this, it would mark a dramatic shift in how Oklahoma's judicial branch is organized. And according to Senator Treat, this would make it align with more like England's system, is what Treat has said. Now, it should be noted that the United States and the framers of our U.S. Constitution and our state intentionally did not design the judiciary to be like the British system, right? So this is
Oklahoma's very populist. We want a say in everybody, including dog catcher, right? Like that's always, the running joke. But it's the reason we're one of the, few areas where we're electing all of these different judges in different positions, and then they have to go on the retention ballot, every so often. And so we do have infrastructure in place that allows Oklahomans to have that say on judges. And if there's somebody that Oklahomans don't like, we can put them out of this process. And I think the other piece to mention, Andy, is that this isn't just an Oklahoma idea that just came out of thin air for Senator Treat and others who are supporting this joint resolution. This is part of a national strategy and an agenda that's an idea that's floating across the country as a way to not only just make elections more partisan, but also to ensure that people can affiliate with an ideology and then have more, I'd say, control over outcomes of what comes out of the courts based on people's philosophies.
So he really said that this would make our system more like the British system.
mm-hmm.
That's his justification. Didn't we fight a war to keep our shit from being like the British system? Wasn't that the whole thing? Like, we want to do our stuff differently than the way the Brits do it. And don't kid yourself. I'm an Anglophile. I love England, right? The Brits are great. But like, and I also say, we've talked about this in the show, I think there are myriad problems with the fact that we elect judges and that we have judges that are put in office by popular vote. Like, in my opinion, that is not the way to do it. But the correct way to do it is not to just have the governor appoint them, right? Like, the correct way to do it for me would be actually to expand the Judicial Nominating Commission and give them more power and let them pick all of the judges. This is a way to deprofessionalize the judiciary, right? Like, this is a way to get people to get judges in office that the politicians who are appointing them feel confident they're going to rule the way that they want, not what the law says, right? Like, that's. And as you guys said, I think there's a recognition, certainly on the part of the Republicans, that partisanship is increasingly becoming the primary identity by which people identify themselves, right? And that's a powerful motivating factor. And so if your goal is political power, if you can further make things partisan, especially in a state like Oklahoma, where you have an overwhelming partisan advantage, you're just building in structure to retain that power, make that power as deeply entrenched for as long as possible. I think, there's already a lot of pushback on this, right? I think the Bar Association has pushed back on this pretty hard. There have been some have we had some former Supreme Court justices? There's been some pretty high profile people who have spoken out about this, right?
Yeah. So the Oklahoma Bar Association is, I think, formally opposed to this. The Trial Lawyers Association is also opposed, and in fact, this is the message that the Bar Association put out on Thursday the 5th, which was yesterday as we're recording this. It says, this measure would, among other things, give the legislature jurisdiction over regulation of portions of the practice of law, which could have a direct impact on the quality of legal services. the repeal of the current constitutional language, because this measure would repeal the state constitution articles 7A and 7B. So it would repeal those. That would remove district courts from existence and would completely change how justices and appellate judges are appointed. It would require judicial candidates for, quote, inferior courts that are created by the legislature to run for office like other county offices. The dissolution of the district courts would result in chaos in both civil and criminal matters, costing clients delays and unanticipated expenditures due to the absence of applicable court rules and procedural statutes. In addition, and another thing, this would create a two-class, like a bifurcated class of attorneys in our state. So there would be attorneys that have gone to law school and passed the bar and practiced before the courts, and then other attorneys who do not appear before the court. Those would be licensed and regulated by the legislature. So
that doesn't sound like a terrible idea at all.
Yeah, so I looked into this, and you would have to like go to law school and then basically do an apprenticeship under a judge or another attorney, and then the legislature would be the holder or the awardee of your law license. And like, first of all, we don't need two classes of lawyers. Secondly, this like just changes the system in some really fundamental and highly concerning ways, not just to me, a non-lawyer, non-judge, just a guy, but also to like the State Bar Association, to judges, and it's not a protection thing for them. The Bar Association is concerned with like the rule of law and how it is practiced. Right. And do we have adequate laws, statutes, and rules to govern that? And this would do away with all of that. And that's not exactly what we need as a state right now.
We definitely don't need that because we're already a hyper-partisan society. There's already so much division, and this just further politicizes an entity that we relied on to be blind in its interpretations, right? To be that entity that evaluates constitutionality on, a myriad of issues. And that, from that lens as well is another concern, because now we're going to be leaning on people who have, an R or a D behind their names to make certain decisions rather than thinking about it from the lens of, is this applicable to the Constitution or is it not? One of the complaints that supporters of this joint resolution often reference is the fact that they feel that there's an increased amount of judicial activism by
that's such bullshit. Like, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but that's such bullshit. Anyway,
by more liberal appointees of courts across the country. And one way to combat that idea, especially as this society continues to grow in its complexity, it grows in representation, right? So it was just announced that the first Black and first LGBTQ identifying press secretary was being appointed, right, at the White House. So we're seeing more of these moments of where people who were excluded are being granted rights and opportunities, especially through the courts. And this is one area of, I'd say, backlash for some of that progress, right, is to be able to then have better control of the courts, because now you're electing people based off of a political ideology and affiliation rather than any type of judicial record, right?
Yeah, a merit system, yeah.
Does he mean like do they mean judicial activism, like, I don't know, overturning 50-year-old precedents, like that kind of judicial activism?
It is
like
claim that we're being attacked by liberal activist judges on the same week that the U.S. Supreme Court is poised, right, to overturn Roe versus Wade.
Right. like dismantling the constitutionally protected right to privacy, and the other cases on which that right stands, like that kind of judicial activism. I just, I just, I don't really have anything else to say about it. It just, my hope is, if this gets through and it gets on the ballot, I think there are some pretty moneyed interests that would be behind not wanting to see this happen, and I hope they would put some cash behind making sure that this doesn't go through. Do we know, has this kind of I'm not even going to say reform, I'm going to say this kind of remaking of the judiciary, has this happened anywhere else in Oklahoma, or are we the test case?
That's a good question.
And is this an ALEC bill, or did like Greg Treat just come up with this, did Greg Treat smoke a bowl and come up with this
I don't
between
think
sessions?
things happen. No, I would. That's a good segue though for our next segment. But I think, from what I understand, Senator Treat is the author and kind of primary supporter of it. The state chamber, I think, is endorsing it, and then of course OCPA and their involvement leads me to believe that ALEC is probably involved. I'm not aware of it passing anywhere else in the other states. However, I'm willing to bet that it is being proposed or discussed in a number of other states that are similar to Oklahoma. I would imagine Kansas, Missouri, Alabama, right? Like these, Mississippi, Louisiana, all of these states, probably Texas as well. I'm certain that some of our listeners will let us know. Scott, you did make a very important point, and I want to hit this again as we move to the next item. But this, as a joint resolution, is not a bill that the legislature can adopt unilaterally, or I guess it's not unilateral when there's two chambers, but the legislature can't pass it. The governor can't sign it. It doesn't become a bill or a law that way. This would have to go onto the ballot because it affects amendments to the state constitution. So it would have to go to a vote of the people. And you're quite right. I think I don't know any, I don't know very many. I do know some attorneys who are not financially well off, right? Like they're good-hearted people who work for legal aid in those organizations. But I think by and large, attorneys seem to be a well-resourced constituency, right? Who might be willing to put their money where their mouth is in opposition to this. That's a big deal. So we'll see. Thus far, the current status, listeners, if you're interested in making your voice heard about SJR 43, it is currently in a conference committee. However, only the Senate has named conferencees. Senator Treat, Senator Daniels, Senator Howard, Bullard, Learight, Floyd, and Boren, or who has been named. The House has not yet named any conferencees. And in fact, the last thing I saw from the House was a story in the Oklahoman that quoted Democrat Representative Colin Walkie, who's an attorney, and Republican floor leader John Eccles, who's a Republican. And they both had pretty strong words to say about this measure that were not supportive. So if this goes anywhere, we'll see what happens. Bailey, I'm going to say this. Bailey just put in our chat that Idaho, Montana, Missouri have all had bills like this over the past couple of years. So, indeed.
This is definitely a movement across the country, and I'm pretty sure there's several other states that are also changing their judicial appointment system to allow governors to have more control. And to Andy's point, I'm willing to bet that it's states that have Republican governors, right?
Yep. Right. Who are Republican majorities
for this measure. So,
and not to get like too conspiracy-ish on this, because it's not a conspiracy. It's pretty well documented, and they've been pretty public about it. But the Republican Party had a concerted effort, right, to gerrymander state legislative districts 10 years ago, and to do it again, last year. And to take, so they have a majority of state legislatures right now are controlled by Republicans, even where they may not actually. They have an outsized majority of state legislatures, and they've been pretty public about making a goal to overtake and we'll say just amend or change the judicial system in those states too, right? So that there is a partisan takeover. And I would call it out if it was the other party too. This is stuff that The whole reason we have a checks and balances designed government is to be a check and balance on power in this stuff. And when you have one party that is so closely aligned on so many things, and their concerted effort is to align the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branch behind their ideology, it minimizes the voice of the public, of everybody. Even if for our listeners who are Republicans, there's a good chance that the things you care about might not be reflected as these measures become more extreme in their partisanization.
Well, Andy, it's not healthy for our democracy to not have a independent, nonpartisan panel of judicial experts, right, that we call judges, to review information in a way that's blinded from the politics. And the more that we bring politics into the mix of our judicial system, the more that we have distrust, and the more that it, impacts the stability of our democracy and functioning in the way that it should be, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you look over time, when we're looking at landmark decisions that were made in this country, it was through the courts, right? Especially in times of strife and political turmoil, especially like when you're looking like civil rights era and other times in our country, that nonpartisan independent entity was able to make judgments in a sound way. And Andy, you raise a great point too, that there's been flaws in that process too over time, where they've made some bad decisions too, right? But at the end of the day, we should have a system that's independent going forward, that ensures that the politics of the day don't determine what is constitutional, what is not constitutional, what is right or what is wrong, right? And I worry that these changes will lead to the politicization of this third branch that is so critical.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Roe, Brown versus Board of Education, those, while I think are good for society, there's certainly plenty of other decisions that have been harmful and bad, particularly as you go back, right? What's the big one? Dred Scott, right? That wasn't. Am I thinking of Dred Scott correctly? I think that's the one that basically said that if you were a descendant of a slave, that you weren't intended to be a U.S. citizen, right? Like there's, in some quotes, in fact, I just pulled the Wikipedia page. Some of the quotes say it is Chief Justice Hughes called it the court's greatest self-inflicted wound, and universally historian Junius Rodriguez said it's universally condemned as the U.S. Supreme Court's worst decision ever. So they haven't always been good. All right. Well, since we're talking about amendments to the state constitution, or things going on the ballot, at least this week, the groups that are promoting what we call adult use recreational marijuana are cleared for signature collection. So starting this past Tuesday, which is, I think, May 3rd, they're able to get out there. The group is called Oklahomans for Sensible Marijuana Laws. So they now have 90 days to collect 94,910 signatures to get the question on the ballot. So that is not a constitutional amendment. That is a statutory amendment. So just a law, not a constitutional change. That petition would it would legalize cannabis for anyone 21 and up, and would impose a 15% sales tax, excise tax, on all recreational marijuana sales. Now that tax rate is essentially double what the tax rate currently is on medical marijuana purchases. And the way it would work is like if you still have your medical card and you buy it at a dispensary, it's only 7%. But if you don't have your card, you'd pay an extra 8% tax on that. So, in fact, I saw some folks this week out collecting signatures, had the vests on, clipboards, and it made me a little inspired for how things are happening in Oklahoma, because it's been a couple of years since we've had a signature gathering effort. But I love good direct democracy and people out there trying to collect signatures.
Well, and Andy, this is already going to be a high turnout, high attention election year for Oklahoma. And if there is a ballot measure related to marijuana, that's going to be another subset of voters who are going to be activated to turn out to vote, especially depending on, should they collect the signatures in time, which election it's going to be, placed on. Is it going to be placed in June or August or November? Either way, that could be another draw for people to turn out the vote. Because we saw that in 2018. Am I correct? Was that
when the medical thing?
Medical marijuana?
I thought it was before that, but it all, anything in the before times kind of blends together.
Anything before 2020.
Yeah, before 2020, I don't remember. I mean, I guess that probably makes sense. 2018 probably makes sense. There was an effort to pass or to get this same kind of adult use recreational marijuana on the ballot back in 2019 when I was working on People Not Politicians and our anti-gerrymandering ballot initiative, and we all got sidelined by the COVID pandemic, right? Couldn't collect signatures when people wouldn't leave the house or even open the door to strangers. So this is very interesting to see how it goes. And I guess we'll see what happens. I think in the next couple of weeks, I'll see if I can get someone like Ryan Kiesel on the show to talk about this, because I think he's been working. I know he works with a number of cannabis clients, and so we'll get to see. I actually did not reach out to him this week, and our thoughts are with Ryan, his family, and everyone else who lives out in Seminole in that part of the state. I know Ryan
had some bad weather over the past week.
Yeah, I texted him the other day, and during the storms, because I wasn't sure if he had family out there, and he still does, and so certainly a tense night for them. And thankfully, unless it's changed, I haven't seen that anyone was seriously injured or killed in those storms the other night. But golly, I used to really enjoy storm season, and lately I just don't. Right, like it's now maybe I'm older. Young kids, it just makes me more nervous than it used to. So
when it just feels like even with the weather alerts and things that are going out, it feels like even it's a majority of the state that's under a tornado watch, right? And so it normally feels like, oh, it's these few counties over here, these few counties over there. Because the running joke is always, for Oklahomans, that you get to know where places are around the state and the names of different communities during storm season. But now it feels like all of us are in this together. And so our thoughts are definitely with the people who live in Seminole for any of the destruction that they faced.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, listeners, you don't know this, but Scott had to leave the program today. It's a schedule conflict, so it's just Bailey and I for the rest of the episode. And Scott's going to be sad, I think, to miss out on the fact that we're now going to talk about barbecue.
Barbecue?
Well, not really barbecue. We're going to talk about corruption related to barbecue, and the latest with the Swadley's saga. I guess is probably a good way to say it, right? Is that the state house panel that was formed, I guess, last week to investigate the Department of Tourism has set their first meeting and have issued some subpoenas. Who is most...
Well, Andy, before we get into this, I definitely want to give kudos in my, I guess, regular times of lifting this to our independent journalism bodies like NonDoc, the Frontier Oklahoma Watch, who have done excellent coverage. And then I'll also lift the Oklahoman, because they were able to get some key interviews and information that are helping to piece together the story of what got us here and what happened to where Swadley's was able to get all of this money, through backdoor deals and not following through on, government processes, which isn't necessarily on Swadley's, but more so on the government side, right? And figuring out where things slip through the cracks and who's responsible. And so just want to give kudos to our bodies of journalism out there for getting us this good information.
That's right. The fourth estate, as the press is called. I don't really know what that means, but I'm equally glad that they're out there doing this work. Also, one outlet you didn't mention that I think is worth a plug for the next story we'll talk about, but Fox 25, right? The Oklahoma City local Fox affiliate, not Rupert Murdoch Fox News, but just the local affiliate. They had a number of stories about this, and KFOR as well, about the education funding stuff. So we'll get into that in a second, but back to barbecue. Ooh-wee. So they've subpoenaed Mike Jackson, who is the director of LOFT, the Legislative Office of Fiscal Transparency, and Stephen Harp, who is the director of OMES, to testify at their first meeting. Bailey, what do you make out of those people being subpoenaed first?
Well, the purpose of particularly LOFT being created, right, was to better streamline where our dollars are going, and to ensure a fiscal transparency in the processes. The legislature, and then I include the governor, within that triangle, their only responsibility, right, is to pass a state budget and to handle the fiscal matters of the state. That's their constitutional responsibility, right? And so when we create entities like LOFT, they have involvement or obligation to ensure that things are happening in line with the processes set that ensure ethical contracts are made and that our tax dollars are spent responsibly thereof, right? And so those two entities will give key information on where the breakdown happened, right? Because there's a whole lot of, finger pointing. I think about that meme of the Spider-Mans all pointing at each other, because, for example, with the executive branch is saying that, rules weren't followed and they definitely want to stop corruption, but the contractor Swadley's is pointing the finger back saying, y'all told us we could do this and you helped us do this, right? And so getting to the entities that are responsible for bringing these contracts in, but then also ensuring that they're going through the process is going to be key to have their testimonies of what exactly happened and who should be held accountable.
I mean, at this point, it's approaching soap opera status, right? Where the governor's Brent Swadley, well, his spokesperson Carly Atchison called him Brett Swadley in one tweet, right? Bront, they're all good dogs, Bront, but they basically I don't know the man. No idea. We have no relationship. And then
but Andy, even before that, there was a controversial tweet weeks prior to everything going haywire of one of the governor's staffers taking a picture with a drink and a Swadley's burger saying, "Ooh, I love this food," even though there was an investigation in the midst, right? And now all of a sudden there's been a 180 in association completely. So,
but it just felt I think this might have all been this week. It all runs together, but the governor was I don't know the man. I have no relationship. And then Brent Swadley had an interview where he was I can't believe you said that. I was in tears. And everyone's okay, this is getting a little silly now.
Because it
Like-
was rumored that whoever was talking to whom was like, oh, I know the governor. I'm gonna just text the governor, and that's the alleged language that went out. So to be like,
But
you
there,
know,
admittedly,
I
there's a
don't
big
know this
difference.
guy, then
Right.
it's
Yeah.
who's telling the truth.
Well, yeah, because Swadley like posted a picture of them together and whatever, and like I've met Governor Stitt, I met Governor Fallon a number of times and had lovely conversations, but she doesn't know me from Adam. Like we don't have a relationship.
Right.
Now, what could come out in the investigation here, right? I think they're starting broad. They're starting with the agency directors, and they will, narrow down into some of the key names. But is there a paper trail? Is there tangible documentation that shows that somehow Stitt was involved? I could see at this level, maybe he's not. And in fact, one name that I would expect that Loft or that the House panel would call is Gino DeMarco, right? Who is the former now deputy director of tourism. And, he was the PPE czar. We've mentioned him on the show before.
Yeah, the guy who created this new business to then bring in.
Yeah, he bought like 26 acres right by, like adjacent to Lake Murray, with a marina and all this stuff. And this was a story in the Oklahoman, again from Dave Cathy, who's has a history as an investigative reporter, but now is the food dude, right? And so the fact that it came out that during all of this development, that DeMarco back in February of 2020 bought these properties, and they're saying, well, he sold them before all this stuff happened, and it still just smells a little funny, right? And because why would he, who was involved in all this and who we do know like has a relationship with Brett Swadley and has a relationship with former director Winchester and the governor, he was in the middle of all of this, and there was a business transaction. And if it was me, again, this is maybe this is me, but like if you're in that role, you have to be above board. There is an expectation that you rise above and you have no appearance of malfeasance.
And you know what keeps that appearance of malfeasance? Following process. Going through the government steps of procurement and other things to ensure that there is no bias in the selection processes and that things are happening in an accountable way. And those things didn't happen. And
it's somewhat funny to me, Bailey, to be honest, because like he bought the property through his property company called DeMarco Property. So like if he was trying to hide stuff, he didn't do a very good job because it's named after him, right? Like if you're gonna do a crime, as they say, like you should maybe try to hide your tracks a little bit. I'm not saying this was a crime. I'm just saying like it was very not well hidden. And maybe that's the point. Maybe he was,
or just elevated questions, right? It just brought more attention.
Yeah. So so that's happening. So we'll see what comes out of that. The first meeting of that House panel is next week or the week after. I just closed that tab, so I forget the exact date. But in the background, as we mentioned, the other big news story this week that relates to state government is with State Education Secretary Ryan Walters and some pretty big questions about his involvement and with how the Stitt administration spent some essentially like COVID related dollars, right, to certain families. And I think we talked about this last week on the show. The big question that came out, I guess this was this morning, so today's Friday the 6th, is the Frontier and Oklahoma Watch requested like a month ago copies of these audit reports that were prepared by former OMES, former State Finance Secretary Jill Geiger and her firm, that looked into how this money was being spent. They submitted 3 reports, but the administration only released 2 of them. Why only 2? Is my question. There should be 3. These are all taxpayer funded reports that are about taxpayer money being spent by taxpayer funded individuals. This is this surely meets the criteria for open records, but we have not seen that third report. And again, Bailey, to go back to what we said, when things are hidden or kept from the public, it causes them to smell a little funny.
Well, in that piece from Oklahoma Watch, it says Stitz spokesperson Carly Atchison claimed Thursday in a statement to Oklahoma Watch and the Frontier that the state had instead prepared the Bridge the Gap report, so that third one, for a potential lawsuit against the for-profit company that oversaw the relief program, making it exempt from the Oklahoma Open Records Act. So they said, based on the fact that it was going to be used towards a lawsuit, that it doesn't qualify to be released through the Open Records Act, and that it's in draft form to determine if further work is necessary. So that report is not yet complete.
This, I will say this again. The Open Records Act, the Oklahoma Open Records Act, is not designed, it is not written to be limiting. It is designed to set the floor, right? The minimum. It establishes the minimum of what must be released. It does not at all set the maximum that is allowed. Agencies, officials are allowed to release as much as they'd like, barring some kind of court order saying they can't. And that is not the case here. Now, they don't have to. There are exceptions that allow them to not, but they still could if they wanted to, right? So if they want to do the right thing, they still can. If they want to release the report, they still can. And we saw this with the Epic audit, right? Where the AG's office and the state administration chose not to release it. And the state auditor was like, this deserves to be out there. And her office released it. So I
and got an award, I believe, right, for their work related to.
Yes, that's right. She won an award for her investigation. Come on. And regardless,
and part of the reason that there's still more work and that it's in draft form is because, based on this piece from Oklahoma Watch and the Frontier, that there was alleged fraud in the way that the monies were spent and who they were spent on. So the monies were intended to go to school supplies with this pandemic relief funding, and it was instead spent on video game consoles and barbecue smokers, TVs and smartwatches and other things that aren't related to the purpose. And so that might be another reason why that particular report is not being released, because they want to figure out what things they want to do to do damage control, and also to hold accountable this company that, you know, was contracted with, not through the process that the state has for procurements and things, but that they made this mistake in giving the monies out in this way.
Yeah, I think, you know, if I'm going to be generous in this assessment, but I think what the administration was trying to do, and this is being very generous, was to move money very quickly. And that made some sense because people needed school supplies and whatnot. However, they skipped some very important steps that are some checks and balances that exist in the process to ensure that taxpayer money is being spent appropriately, right? And those steps involve, you know, a competitive bidding process to make sure that we're selecting the best firm with the best oversight and infrastructure in place to administer a program like this. If you're going to spend tens of millions of dollars, you want to make sure that they're going to do a good job with it, not just go quickly, right? I could very quickly drop $20 million from an airplane, and we could say we distributed that money back to taxpayers. Just a blanket, right? Yes, you blanketed the city with dollar bills in the sky. You got the money out very quickly, but that is not the way to do it. So just because you were prioritizing speed might mean that you were compromising on security, efficacy, right? some of those
Well, and this is one
safeguards
of the
we need.
reasons why the government rarely works as rapidly as it does in getting money out quickly without parameters and regulation and things like that. Because a lot of people, chalk that to like, oh, that's bureaucracy. But the reality is when those safeguards aren't in place and structures, it leads to too much flexibility where moments happen where things could slip through the cracks and things could be, misspent. Another element that makes this more, I guess, urgent is the fact that the U.S. Department of Education's Office of the Inspector General has opened an inquiry on how the state used those funds, right? Because remember, all of these funds come down from the federal government, and it's a rarity that the government just says, here's money, state of Oklahoma, go spend it how you need. And it's also one of the reasons why I think the legislature took a more intentional approach in how it's designed the American Rescue Plan Act funding process, right? I know a lot of people are like, oh, it's taken a long time and all this kinds of stuff, but they're really trying to do their due diligence, right? And making sure they're aligning with federal guidelines, that they can do what's needed to be done for auditing purposes and spend the money in ways that are going to be most effective for helping Oklahomans, right, in areas where we need it most, right? And so we're seeing, I guess, two ends of the spectrum when it comes to, federal release funds. And I just hope that, with this break today, that it doesn't lead to people having distrust or no confidence in our state government in handling, the influx of pandemic relief funds.
Right. I mean, I think, at the end of the day, we want to know that our taxpayer dollars are being spent responsibly and that they are demonstrating value, right? Like most people don't have a problem paying taxes, provided that we feel like we're getting a good value for that money, right? And
we know how it's being used.
Right. And no one I know paid taxes with the expectation that someone else would get money to buy TVs and barbecues, right? And like, I didn't get that money. I would have kept it if I was going to do that myself. And so, is it expected that maybe a few people would misspend money? Sure. And they would be normally required to like pay that back, right? Like if you misspent the money, and clearly this organization knows what they spent it on. That's how we got this number, right? And so why was someone not reviewing these reports being like, oh, hey, you can't buy that TV, take it back, or pay the money back. But now it's months later and we're just now playing catch up and, everyone's kind of raising their hands being like, I don't know what happened, man. So the other thing that I think is silly, and maybe I'm not a consultant enough, but by stonewalling these reports now, right, and trying to manage the news cycle today, they run the risk that this stuff will come out closer to the election, and it will come out, right? Especially if it's involved in some kind of court proceeding. This is all under discovery. It will come out at some point. Why would you not try to manage the story now rather than risk it coming out the middle of June or the middle of October, right? Like if this is the October surprise that costs the governor or Secretary Walters the election, that seems like a huge miscalculation in their approach to this. Maybe I'm wrong. Well, I guess we'll find out if and when it comes out.
Or maybe another, lens of they're trying to process the information. I mean, there's been a lot going on, right? Especially over the past year on these allegations of corruption from, the Swally situation, what's going on with Epic, and now, this subset of federal relief dollars through this Bridge the Gap digital wallet program. And so maybe this is, with things coming to the light, they're having to scramble to figure out, what is really going on and what's the plan and direction that they want to take. And it seems like going after that contractor that they worked with on distributing the funds, it seems like the angle that they're going to go with, which then gives them time of like, look, when we saw the corruption, we went after it. And this is how we're demonstrating accountability, right? So I guess time will tell on what's going to happen.
Yeah, I guess we'll find out. What an interesting year it's going to be.
Well, and also there's been transition in the governor's cabinet once again. So,
yeah, do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, so the current Secretary of Commerce has transitioned from the cabinet. That person has gone back into private sector work, and so this is the third Secretary of Commerce to have left the administration. So.
Yeah, that's true. And it's not uncommon for cabinet members to, shift around during a term, but having 3 in that position in 4 years seems a little unusual. And I forget who it was, but he worked for Goldman Sachs, I think. He left Goldman Sachs to come to the administration and is going back. And I think has already left the state. So we'll see. And who knows? I mean, the governor might appoint someone new, whoever the governor is after, next year or after the election this year, might appoint somebody new, even if it is Governor Stitt. So I guess we'll find out and see what happens then. But it does seem like the Commerce Secretary leaving in the midst of budget negotiations seems ill-timed.
Indeed.
All right. Well, that brings us to the end of our episode this week. Bailey, thank you for being here.
Of course.
Listeners, thank you for being here as well. Please, if you haven't shared our podcast with your friends or family lately, why don't you do that? Send them a link. You can go to letspodthis.com, and that's the direct link right to our page. You can send it, or just send them from whatever app you use to listen to it. Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Overcast, Spotify, any of those things, really. Anywhere podcasts are found, which seems like everywhere. I saw a list the other day, Bailey, of all the podcast apps, and there was like 80-something apps and websites, most of which I'd never even heard of. And I was so perplexed of like, who listens to these other platforms? I don't have time to go through them and see if one is better than the other. Apple and Spotify seem to work fine for me.
I hear you. I feel like we've moved from like book culture to like podcast, like audiobook culture.
That's true. That's a good point. Yeah. Maybe we should make this long form and do a book. I tried listening to somebody's book the other day. Barack Obama's most recent book. And it's like 27 hours long. And I was like, oh man, this is going to take me 6 years to finish this.
Or a couple of drives to like the East Coast or the West Coast.
That's right. That's what I'll do. That's what I did last time. We drove from Oklahoma to North Carolina a couple of years ago, and we listened to Amy Poehler's book on the way out there and Michelle Obama's book on the way back. And that was a long book too. We didn't get through it all. So, all right, listeners. Well, thanks for being here this week. Remember that decisions are made by those who show up. See you next week.